Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of Straight Talk, sponsored by Inglis and Daly. I'm Brent O'Brien, and joining me as per usual is Tim Rowe. This week, a landmark week for Australian wagering reform, as the federal government set to pass key changes to advertising restrictions. We also look at a growing list of challenges and opportunities for Entain, including fast code class action, ongoing AUSTRAC proceedings, and the resurgence of Australian business. In breeding and bloodstock, the international market continues to surge with fierce competition between the sport's biggest players. Tony Santic to lease his famous Victorian thoroughbred property, and in racing, debate continues around the future direction of industry funding and regional investment, while major operations continue to expand across state borders in search of new opportunities. We'll also be joined by one of the most respected voices in Australasian racing, New Zealand broadcaster and journalist Michael Guerin, to discuss the challenges and opportunities facing New Zealand industry. Tim, it's been a big week. Plenty to cover off. There's a little bit more to cover off. Are you recording this usual a little bit earlier than usual on Wednesday because we're off to the Hunter Valley over the next few days to do a few of the stallion parades and talk to a few people in that part of the world. But the action wasn't in the Hunter, nor was it in the offices of the PRAs or the wagering companies. This week it was in the halls of Parliament, and a landmark moment. Most likely by the time people listen to this, and possibly maybe later on Thursday, it depends when these things get through, we'll finally have a definitive view of what the future of wagering advertising looks like in this country, Tim. I mean, how important is that certainty? We've been sort of stuck in this uncertain mode around what this may look like since the release of the You Win Some, You Lose More report 3 years ago.
Well, yeah, it'd be interesting, and I know you followed it closer than me, exactly what the legislation looks like and the carve-outs and what bookmakers and the industry can actually do, because it has been for sort of 3 years at least, back and forth, and this uncertainty makes it very hard to plan for for bookmakers and B for PRAs to try and model what their revenue is going to look like going forward, and even the predictions of what what impacts these restrictions will have on turnover and revenues. Again, there's modelling, but actual real life experience will tell the tale, and it's going to be fascinating how it actually plays out and how it's implemented. Certainly, some parts of legislation easier said than done to actually implement, I would suggest.
Yeah, and if you want a few more details, plenty of stories about it on the straight. Trust me, I've written plenty about it this week. I've also done a bit of a video explainer to talk through those things as well. So there's plenty to work through. And probably the most significant thing is the opt-out on the advertising aspect, which is pretty much every Australian will have the option to say they opt out for online advertising. As far as I can understand, Tim, I've been leafing through the legislation and amendments today. Racing related content and sites would be carved out or will not be subject to that, which it probably a relief for the racing industry because they do rely upon that high digital engagement through across the various online publications as well. But there's still a few questions around this, the opt-in and how it will work, so the opt-out and how it will work, like just physically how it works. How do you make that happen that people can't see advertising or whatever else? The government's solution is pretty much to say, well, we've put this in, you sort out how to do it, wagering industry, and you've got to pay for it. So I think that there's still a bit to work through there in that aspect. And I just wonder, obviously they're keen to move it on and get it off the political and parliamentary agenda, but there's still a lot to play out here, Tim.
So, and on that, I think just handballing it onto the industry to manage it, and we don't have to look back far, I think, for an example of this with the social media ban for sort of teenagers and under 16s. And to be fair, in my experience with my own kids and their friends and everything, the bans didn't work. There's an easy workaround. So whose responsibility is it? As I said, the government seems to be just pushing it back, or will push it back on the industry. But what technology do they use to try and have the opt-out system? It's not as easy as it looks to the outside, I'd suggest.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see exactly how many people do opt out. And I think they're calling it ad stop. It's sort of a thing with bet stop. But bet stop took 4 years to implement. And the thing about bet stop is that it's it's been effective in many ways, but it's a different type of system whereby, effectively you have a register of customers which you're not allowed to engage with, which is very different from a register of general public people that you can't engage with. It's a bit more like the do not call register, which again, there's nothing to stop someone from calling you a scammer to calling you. It's just the fact that they might get punished by the government. The other thing that this may lend itself to, and it's something that the industry's raised before, is the prospect that international or internationally based bookmakers and that are not licensed in Australia targeting more Australians, because effectively it puts them in a similar level playing field to the regulated gambling industry. So there are some challenges there. Be interested to see what happens. Look, of course, that's going to be a talking point that the regulated gambling industry puts forward, but it's one that deserves consideration given the explosion of international options in that online gambling space, and it's only going to get bigger and bigger. We've spoken about prediction markets on this podcast before and other aspects. It's so easy to fire up a VPN. I'm not saying that you should do it, but at the way things stand at the moment, it's certainly the barriers to go elsewhere, with the exception of not having the consumer protections, are quite minimal as well. So, look, I think we won't know what the precise impacts will be, and honestly, it's always hard to tell in terms of turnover anyway, Tim. Like, it goes up, it goes down. Obviously, there will be some inducement bans as well born in, but that's primarily around VIP customers and inducements being offered to people that are coming off BetStop. I think it looks like it's hard to tell because this has moved quickly, that people who immediately sign up for a bookie will not be able to get an inducement, I think, for 30 days. That will probably, I guess, hurt the acquisition period, I suppose, for the bookmakers, and be interesting to see what happens then. But they'll find other ways to getting customers. It's a very innovative industry. It's an industry that finds a way to its customers. It'll just be interesting to see how all this plays out, and whether an enlarged ACMA who's the regulator, supposed to regulate all this, how they go. So plenty to play out in that space. In the meantime, Tim, we've also got action, other things going on in this space. There's a rather sort of significant case going on in the Victoria Supreme Court at the moment involving Sportsbet around its use of its fast code. There's I think his name is Jeremy Bergman, who's the plaintiff in that case, about saying that fast code is actually a breach of Australia's in-play betting laws, and it should not be allowed. It's pretty much, you put when an event is in play, it's money includes sports, involves sports, but you generate a code and you ring up and you say, whatever the code is, whatever your name is, whatever else, and goes through and you put your money on, you put your bet on. Now, that's also been launched against Entain as well. That case, I think, is due, middle of next year at this stage. Obviously, if the Sportsbet case gets knocked over, it's probably unlikely that the Entain case will proceed, but it's just another thing to Entain to think about. Meanwhile, Entain have also got this AUSTRAC action ongoing, as we've spoken about before, which is another sort of interesting point with that. It sort of became apparent last week that Entain's still in mediation about that one, Tim. So there's a bit happening in that space. And then all this in the context that Entain have had this extraordinary resurgence over the last 12 months, where they've grown 13% of revenue, and they've become something, gone being from the whipping boy of their global empire to the absolute apple of their eye. It's amazing how things can change, and obviously there's been significant changes made at Entain, but it's been interesting to see how they've been received, and clearly they're finding a way to continue to grow their business.
So, you, again, sort of just observing and reading some of the content on the street and sort of out and about listening, they've got back to basics and focused on selling bets effectively. And, they've had a lot of other initiatives that probably got the brand out there, the racing club, which spent a lot of money, and then that was abandoned, and lots of other different things to create engagement. But they've got seemingly back to the core business of selling bets, and obviously it seems quite profitable at the moment.
Yeah, and I think with a strong compliance focus as well, and I think this is probably the reality for the wagering companies going forward. And so, anyway, it might be one of the we've led off on the wagering a couple of times this podcast of lately, Tim, but it certainly has been the hot topic, and obviously it's the financial sort of engine room of the industry, isn't it? It drives so much of how much the industry can spend in other places.
I think the figures at 85-90% of revenue comes from wagering, from the punters. So every participant and stakeholder is important, but without punters, there's no industry. Certainly no racing industry. So, keeping punters on side and engaged and wanting to be involved, as said many a time, I think it's the best betting medium out there and a great sport, but you still need to look after the punters.
The following segment is brought to you by Inglis. The Inglis Ready to Race catalogue goes live this Monday morning, and we're hearing there'll be around 320 entries on offer, a significant increase on the 220 catalogue last year. That surge in numbers comes as no surprise after the outstanding success of the 2025 sale, which has already produced Group 1 winning 2-year-old at Tronbolt, as well as Hard Kick who's a stakes winner at both 2 and 3 from his 3 starts. This year's Breeze Up sessions will be held at Warwick Farm and Taupo later next month. But first things first, make sure you head to Inglis website on Monday morning to expect the 2026 Ready to Race sale catalogue. The catalogue features 111 lots out of black type performers or producers representing 35% of the sale. Those horses sold as yearlings early this year for an average of $103,396 and have been sourced from all the major yearling sales, including Easter, Premier and Classic. Go to inglis.com.au on Monday morning for all your details. Tim, in breeding, and as that live read hinted out, we're moving into sort of the not far away from the 2-year-old sales season. But before we get there, a couple of points we wanted to touch on. The first one was this story actually got a lot of traction when the decision from Tony Santic to lease out or look to lease out his property. Obviously, they're just outside of Geelong, Makybe Stud, synonymous with one of the legends of Australian racing. I guess for Tony, his period of breeding and doing what he needed to do after that, the success of Makybe Diva allowed him to do has probably come to an end in terms of where his life's at and where he wants to go with things. And there's an opportunity for someone else to step in there.
So he's not selling the property; he's just looking to lease it. What I found was interesting, actually, going back through some of the history, that he bought the place in 2003, the year that Makybe Diva won her first Melbourne Cup, and so he has been heavily engaged in the industry for at least 23 years and longer. And yes, he's synonymous with the Melbourne Cup and that great mare and what she achieved. Arguably at stud, she clearly wasn't as successful, but still through a stakes winner, I believe, and there's still a few of the family out and about. But he also bred a lot of other good horses, and none more so than Star Spangled Banner, which he's just going gangbusters up in the Northern Hemisphere as a stallion now. Even though he's getting on a little bit, his influence is phenomenal. With Justard as one at the moment, a 3-year-old up there in the north, and even he bred and co-owned Bigwigs, who won the Vobis Showdown this year. So there's been a lot of good horses come off that property, and commercial farm at that there's an opportunity there for someone to take it on and run it as they see fit and as a genuine commercial entity if they choose. And our friends Clint Donovan and Co are looking after that process as well.
Yeah, obviously the year has come to an end, and sadly we lost Makybe Diva earlier this year, but she's been an absolute icon of the sport. And we've had champions come along since her, but I don't know, but I'm with Lee Friedman. We'll find the smallest person on the track, and I don't think we'll find the youngest person on that track. We probably won't find her win 3 Melbourne Cups again. She was just an extraordinary horse, and her legacy will live on beyond that. But she was, of course, had an international pedigree herself, being bred out of the UK. But and it was interesting to see this Northern Hemisphere, spending spree continue at Arqana this week. Coolmore and Godolphin have been going at it, trying to get the same horses at the yearling sale since 1981, Tim, which might be before your time, and it's just not quite before my time. But it's remarkable to think that we've gone so long. This rivalry continues, and we saw them just smashing out of the park. I think 4.6 million euros, which is equivalent, I think, 7.5 million Australian, spent on a Wooten Bassett colt. There's a strong demand for others as well. A record, a French record in terms of price. It just seems, particularly at that top end, that Northern Hemisphere, American and European sales market is just so strong.
There's been, big investors come and go. We've seen it in Australia, I guess, even, Patinack and Ammo Racing in the UK, sort of more recently. They're still spending a lot of money, but Coolmore and Godolphin and Sheikh Mohammed just, as you say, since 1981, going at it and trying to, acquire elite horses. And what was interesting was Godolphin, I think they spent close to 21 million Aussie equivalent on a lot of horses. After the second day, they'd bought 5 of the top lots.
Yeah, top lots,
the 5 top lots until Coolmore got involved. So it's just very interesting, the level of expenditure there at the top end. It is a luxury item, I guess, owning racehorses. But so does it apply to Australia and certainly the middle market? Possibly not, but just shows that there's still interest at that top level, and a lot of those players will be involved in Australia in some way, either big or small, come next year.
Yeah, exactly right. And the reality is like we're going to the stallion parades this week, Tim, and Coolmore and Darley will be 2 of our destinations, and their investment in Australia has been massively significant. I would say, obviously we've had Geelong in the last 5 to 10 years, but like what's gone on in terms of what Coolmore and what Dali have put into Australia is quite remarkable. Yeah, and I said their ambitions are still as strong as ever. Any thoughts that maybe Godolphin were pulling back globally? I don't think you can say that's happening. I tell you what, there was nothing more certain in the world when you knew that Godolphin had beaten Coolmore to two or three horses on the Monday, or sorry, on the Sunday it was, on the Monday that Coolmore were going to come back hard, and MB Magnia stepped up with a 4.6 million euro bid, which is quite extraordinary in that regard. A couple other stories I point your way during the week here. We had a look at the amount of, I guess, which sires had the most named 2-year-olds of the first season sires, and Animo clearly leads the way with 43. There's a lot of anticipation about his crop, Tim. We saw during the yearling sale season how in demand that they were, and yeah, it'd be fascinating to see because he was such an interesting horse in that one of the very few horses that was able to perform very close to the top level at the top level as a 2-year-old, go on and win many Group One races. I think 9 in total as a 3 and 4-year-old. He was a remarkable horse, wasn't he? And I think that there's a real anticipation about his stock coming through.
Well, he had his first start at the debutante stakes in sort of early October in Melbourne and raced right through the 2-year-old season. And I think he drew out wide in the slipper, unlucky. Came back at 3 and interesting, his stock, understandably high profile horse, sold very well. Perception is maybe they'll take a bit more time or a little bit of time, but you know, just the quality of mares he got, the pedigrees that are out there with the right trainers, that he's going to have every chance, and hopefully for the industry that he does go on with it and throw some really nice horses.
Yeah, although I've had 40% of his foals already named, and we're in sort of mid-August. It does show that there's probably a bit of expectation they might actually be more forward than they think, but we'll see what happens with that. A couple of other points the winner, Chili Girl, on the weekend, obviously had a quite interesting pedigree, and one of the things that run the numbers this week was looking at I guess, the influence between General Nadim and Snitzel and the combination of their bloodlines. Worthwhile having a look at that. Obviously, similar horses in race profile, both star 2-year-olds, favourites in their respective Golden Slippers, came back as 3-year-olds and won open age races, and then went on to have influences at stud. The other thing that was pointed out to me by James Mitchell yesterday, because after he posted that photo yesterday of Billy Mitchell looking about 6 and Peter Moody looking about 8, was that Billy Mitchell also had a connection because he trained Snippet's lass, who was, of course, Snitzel's dam. So some interesting sort of details around that. But anyway, worthwhile having a look back. And what it does tell you, you just got to look at the fact how young Peter Moody looks in that photo. I think I was 97, I think, I'm pretty from memory. We're talking almost 30 years later, and we've still got General Nadim having an impact, including as a broodmare sire of a stakes winner last weekend. But ongoing, these fast Australian breeds. We talk about shuttle stallions and their value, but these fast Australian breeds always have ongoing value, don't they, Tim?
Also, the broodmare sire of a Hong Kong Derby winner this year, Brent, as well, might add.
Yes, indeed. You should know that quite well.
Yes.
The following segment is brought to you by Dali. You only have to look at the names: Dubai Millennium, Dubawi, Too Darn Hot, Broadsiding, Night of Thunder, Ombudsman, and Gayath. It's a line that keeps moving the breed forward. And then there's Observer, a Group 1 Australian Guineas winner and a Group 1 Victoria Derby winner. The next generation of the Dubawi dynasty, standing this season at Dali. Tim, a couple of little points of the racing space before we get to our quite extensive chat with our good mate Mick Guerin. We left the chat with Michael Guerin to the end of the podcast because it's quite an extensive chat. So if you are up for a sit around the fire, pull up a cup of coffee, or maybe pull the top of a beer, or pour yourself a glass of wine or something to have a listen through that, because it's quite an extensive chat, but highly entertaining, and always good to have him on board. Before we get to that, a couple of things I wanted to point out to you. There's a letter to the editor that's worth looking at today from Helen Sinclair, who's a very experienced racing administrator around various places in New South Wales. Just about the Racing of the Regions program, which is sort of, there's been some scrutiny around that and where that's at. Worthwhile for a read. Again, we don't publish that many letters to the editors on the straight, but where we do have ones which sort of deal with some of these key issues in a sort of reasoned, professional manner, we're quite happy to put them out there. The other one, which was quite interesting, Tim, which sort of came to us late last week, we confirmed it early this week, is Sarah Ryan not moving, but expanding to Victoria. Now, she's probably not the biggest stable to have 2 state footprint, but I guess the opportunity to go to Mount Macedon was too good for her.
she's obviously gone out on her own. She was private trainer for Domeland, and at sort of end of last or the previous season, now she opened up her own stable at Wyong, and as a public trainer, and any young ambitious trainer getting owners and getting horses in the stable is part of that, and that's what I think the opportunity of Macedon Lodge allows. To me, the interesting part of the story, yes, Sarah expanding is part of it, but the fact that uh, Bruce and Michael Dixon they bought Mason Lodge from Lloyd Williams in 2022, and they've spent a lot of money upgrading it or improving infrastructure on the site. And at the time, it was certainly published, whether Bruce meant it, but it was certainly out there that this is purely a business decision, won't be owning any horses, and so on. But now they've, as often happens, you can't avoid it. They've got 20 to 25 now, just turned 2-year-olds to go into work with Sarah, and they'll be going on, back at the sales again next year, and even looking at international horses to bring down. It does have a good record. Lloyd Williams won multiple Melbourne Cups with horses trained there. Obviously Knight's Choice won the Cup there 2 years ago. So they're looking at that angle as well. Grant Morgan sort of been advising them not with the horses so far, but sort of their media strategy and things like that, on track thoroughbred. So I think from a bloodstock industry point of view, interesting that there's another significant player in the market that will be buying horses and syndicating horses. And from Magic Millions onward next year, we'll see them on the buy sheet, I'm sure. Macedon Racing.
Before we head to our chat with Mick Guerin, Tim, are you Team Autumn Glow or Team Choosing Alibi this weekend? It's great to have these two champion mares clashing so early in the spring, and first Group 1 race of the season, isn't it?
Yeah, it'll be a great race. Just interesting how forward they are. I'm not saying they'll protect them, but it's a long spring ahead. Obviously, She's Alibi heading to the main targets, the Golden Eagle, $10 million. So they're not going to be screwed down, but they've both drawn to get soft runs. You'd think Autumn Glow will be ahead of She's Alibi in the run, so it's going to be a fascinating race, and hopefully we can find a pub somewhere to watch the race on Saturday, Brent.
Yeah, that'll be the plan, I think. I think the race is not to 4:30, so we've got a little bit of time. It's a bit later. I think it might be early. I think last year, from memory, Tim, we were driving along back one of those roads at the back of Rochelle Road, or one of those roads at the back of Aberdeen, listening to I think Via Sistina win the Wink Stakes. So hopefully we'll be a bit more ensconced somewhere else by that point. But anyway, no, it is good to have the good horses coming back, and exciting time of year with spring. Always plenty to talk about. And always plenty to talk about with Mick Guerin, of course. And here was our chat with Mick. It was an extensive chat. It was great to catch up with him and have a listen through and see what you think. And joining us now on Straight Talk is one of New Zealand's racing's most prominent media voices, Michael Guerin, our racing editor of the New Zealand Herald and host of the Guerin Report, at a time when New Zealand racing faces a series of significant challenges, including funding pressures, infrastructure concerns, governance reform, and difficult decisions around the future of racecourses. Michael has been speaking directly with key decision makers in recent times. Today, we'll get his assessment of the issues, the reality behind the headlines, and what the future may hold for the thoroughbred industry in New Zealand. Mick, thanks for joining us.
Evening to you, Brent, to you, to Timmy, and to all your listeners, mate. Thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's been interesting. We're watching from afar, I guess, of your coverage over the last few weeks. There are issues that we've covered in depth as well. We try to get a strong coverage of what's going on in New Zealand, because there's plenty of interest in Australia, and we've also got plenty of New Zealand listeners and readers as well. I mean, in your sort of extensive discussion with the racing figures over recent months, what do you believe is the single biggest financial challenge facing New Zealand thoroughbred racing, Michael?
The biggest one, Brent, is infrastructure, because the debts, or some of the money that's coming in and some of the money that's going out, like with an Entain, you can raise the turnover by 10%. And if the GBR on a turnover of 10% raise, so say you have an extra $100 million being bet on gambling, which is a mythical figure, but say you do, and say the GBR, the gross betting return on that's 25%, well, that's $25 million. So that sounds like an awful lot of money, but it's not once you have Alexandra Park, which is a harness track, owing $80 million, when you have the Waikato Greenfields, which could cost $100 million more. You have Hastings building a new track, which could be budgeted at 40 but cost 50 or 60. So infrastructure is the big deal because the numbers are so huge that no matter how much more you drive turnover, they're not going to cover it because, of course, in 2 years' time, the extra turnover money gets split down the middle with Entain. And that's very fair. They've given us a massive 5-year head start on things. But infrastructure is the key, and that's why this idea, which I hadn't really thought of myself, even though I've been around racing for such a long time, of eventually setting up a special property vehicle. I don't know what's called that. It's more of a trust. And part of that would be pooling some of the assets. For example, Ellerslie might say, okay, we're taking 150 million of the liquidity or the capital we have in Ellerslie, which is worth an enormous amount more than that. And we'll put that into a trust, as might a Trentham, as might Waikato, as might a couple of the harness racing tracks. And all of a sudden, the idea around that is that with that liquidity put into a trust, and I'm talking in very loose terms because it's quite technical stuff, which will be worked out in the future. Say you had 500 million in the trust or of assets you can borrow against. All of a sudden, things like 10 million, which is going to be NZTR's payment to Hastings when they try to build their new track, that's not an issue. All of a sudden, $3 or $4 million, which might be owed by Trentham, is not an issue. All these issues start to become very small once you have that property trust or property vehicle put together, fellas. But if you don't put it together, then what you have is a very rich club in Ellerslie who have very significant investments in land holdings. And there's a good chance that Avondale, which is the track they've closed in Auckland, could merge into Ellerslie. So Ellerslie will get richer. And around the rest of the country, you'd have these pockets of tracks with, like Awapuni, having infrastructure problems, but without the money to solve them by themselves. So of all the things that are going to happen in New Zealand racing in the next 2 years, having this singular property vehicle or trust probably becomes the most important because managed in the right hands without a parochial lens over top of it and just saying this is a good decision and this is a good investment and we need, for example, we need Alexandra Park kept for the next 10 years because having it in a fire sale now is a disaster. Maybe we can sell it in 10 years when the Waikato Greenfields is up. Those things make financial sense. But to do that, Bren, you need all that money behind you. So that's the biggest problem, and it comes with a solution which will not be easy to put together, but once it's set up, could well be a panacea for a lot of the issues we're having in New Zealand.
Finding a agreement on how that should be managed is one thing, but it sounds like, have we got to this point through a lack of funding or a funding problem, or is there a governance problem, I guess, with, harness racing and NZTR? Sort of how have we got to this point, I guess?
Well, I think a lot of the tracks, Timmy, are old. And they're old and we haven't invested well in them. Ellerslie had the money to do so, and they are the shining light at the end of the tunnel for New Zealand racing. So they've proven they can do it. And there's some really good people trying to do some really intelligent things. Like a Waikato Greenfields is a really good idea because eventually you can sell to Rapa and Cambridge to pay for it. But to sell to Rapa and Cambridge to pay for it, you still need to get the thing built in the first place, which again might cost you $100 million, and again comes back to liquidity or the ability to borrow against other assets. I don't think anybody's done too much wrong in the way of governance. The governance of New Zealand racing has been a big concern for a long time because clubs get votes and clubs tend to see things very parochially. And in the last year, I've thought quite a bit about New Zealand racing and New South Wales racing. And a lot of people don't like Peter V'landys. I know Peter works for a board and they're supposed to give him mandates, but you still need that really strong leadership. And I think in New Zealand there's been far too many boards, far too many reports, and far too many fingers and too many chiefs and not enough Indians. And I've thought a lot in the last years have come to these problems about having that person who goes, no, enough of this shit, we're going to do it this way and get it done. And that, I think, is what New Zealand racing ultimately leads. So I do think there needs to be some governance changes, and I do think you need to have less external directors because I think external directors often come with financial or legal qualifications, but a lot of the times they don't understand the minutiae of racing and where the New Zealand racing industry sits, not only for itself and in the gambling market, but of course in the Pan-Pacific market into Australia and of course into Hong Kong. You need a pretty good understanding of those things to be able to make that level of decision. And I think, without being belittling, I think the people on the TAB advisory committee had a really good understanding of that. I think some of the people on the racing governance bodies don't have as good an understanding, and that's why it would seem to make sense to listen to the TAB advisory and their recommendations, because they're pretty much, without buttering anybody's toast here, fellas, yeah, you're talking to Peter Valley, you're talking to Brendan Lindsay, you're talking, Greg Tomlinson, Chris Waller's involved, Mark Chittick. These are the smartest people in the game. So if you're not going to listen to them, then who are you going to listen to?
Is there a challenge here? I guess part of the challenge is there's been a lot of change in New Zealand already. Like with the Entain deal, it changed things up a lot, Michael. It obviously the stakes increased. They've already got a little bit excited, but there's been a significant sort of, I guess, power shift to a certain extent in the way things are working. What you said before about sort of needing someone to sort of pretty much drag everyone and drag them kicking and screaming into the new era. I mean, change is always hard in any industry, and some of the stuff you're talking about, as you said before, it's the same challenges facing the Australian jurisdictions as well. How do you get people on side? How do you because immediately you take a position. So people will hear what you say before and say, oh, well, he belongs in that team and you belong in this team. How do we get beyond this team argument to a point where there's a greater good here, Michael?
Well, that's a really good question, because that's racing to a T. Yeah. My trainer's my man or my woman, that my man, your man said this and your jockey did this. And if you don't like somebody, they can't ride. And if you do like them, they're a genius in the saddle. So racing's had that issue for a long time. Personally, I don't care about the personalities. I know there's people I love in racing who are idiots, and I love them because they're idiots. And there's people who are really smart in racing who I don't like, but I respect. And there's people like John Massara who I didn't know, and I've grown to have enormous respect for because their body of work is so strong. And I think that's what you need to do. You need to distance yourself from the emotions and say, look, is Peter Valley a smart guy? Yeah, he's a smart guy. Is Brendan Lindsay a smart guy? Yeah, they're the smart guys. They're not getting paid for this report. They're not doing it because they need the money. They're doing it because they want New Zealand racing to do well. And if you look at that motive without any Cambridge stud or NZB lens over it, well, it's the right thing to do. This is the smartest report we've had, and the Massara report was pretty darn smart. But if you're not going to follow those people, then all the other counter arguments and my man, your man, all that nonsense, well, it just means that you don't want what's good for the industry. You want what's good for you. And they're two very different things. I do think we lack. One of the big questions about New Zealand racing, it's a really interesting question for you guys and for your listeners. If I said to somebody, who's the most powerful man in Australian racing, you know straight away it's Fernandez. That's just a fact. If I said to you, who's the most powerful person or who is the leader of New Zealand racing, give me a name. You haven't got one. And if you don't have a leader, whether it's a football team, a government, an army, if you don't have somebody who's ultimately charged with making those decisions, then you've got a problem, because it's really hard for two people to make a decision together and agree on it, let alone 30 or 50 or 100, which is what we have in our governance structure. So we do need a leader. We need a leader to come into New Zealand racing. Now, Entain tried to fill that void when they came in, and for a little while, Dean Shannon was the most powerful person in New Zealand racing. And they did nothing wrong. They just sprinkled a whole heap of sugar on a whole bunch of things, and everybody enjoyed eating it. And it really helped a lot of causes. But Andrew Voris has been really clear about the fact that they are here to take bets and promote that side of the industry, and this isn't their stuff to fix, as it shouldn't be. Because if a bookmaker's fixing all your problems, that means a bookmaker's running your industry, which they shouldn't be doing. So then you say, okay, with Dean having gone there, and Andrew would have the potential to be the most powerful person in New Zealand racing, but of course Andrew's also running Entain Australia's interests. And then you look at the governance structure and you say, is it Matt Balesti? Is it NZT? Harness Racing New Zealand don't have a chief executive at the moment. You start to say, well, who is this person? And I don't think there's an answer to that. And I think that's really scary for people. I did a couple of shows the last couple of weeks just explaining really basic stuff. It wasn't massively revealing. It wasn't, incredible stuff. But just explaining the basics to people of how the funding system works, people are like, wow, I didn't know that. The reason I don't know it is because they don't have anybody to explain it to them. So the question is, I think what we're going to see in the next week, I'll give you boys a prediction, and this is the first time I've publicly spoken about it. I think the TAB will get sign-off from the codes. I think they'll agree on their budgets. And I think part of the agreement for that will be they will agree to merge the two administrations over the next year to 18 months. So I think harness racing and New Zealand thoroughbred racing will become one entity to a degree, much like Queensland racing type thing.
Yeah.
Or WA to a degree. And I think they'll agree to the property vehicle. Now, then they'll need to put a really powerful board in place to implement that, because it's one thing to have the theory of it. I think in the next 2 weeks, that'll be announced. So I think there'll be some really big progress made at really big constitutional legislative levels. I think that will happen, and then the pathway forward will be at least clearer. If it doesn't happen, then we're just going to go around in this silly dance for potentially years to come. And we can't afford to do that. They'll start closing Trentums. They'll start closing Alexandra Parks. They'll close things, Brennan, to me we can never get back. But I think in the next 2 weeks, maybe even sooner, I think that'll be announced, and I think there will be some clarity about the positions. Some of the other positions from the advisory committee will have to wait till after the election. There'll be no tax changes, all that sort of stuff. It's an election year in New Zealand, I think on November the 8th or 7th. So those things will have to go back, because then there's another question: does Winston Peters remain as racing minister? Because you could make a case he's the most powerful person in New Zealand racing, but of course he's our foreign minister as well. So he's got lots of other things on his plate, so therefore he doesn't deal with the day-to-day handling of New Zealand racing. So there's a whole bunch of questions after the election. So 2 or 3 of those really big ticket items are going to wait till after the election. But I think in the next 2 weeks there'll be an announcement that there'll be an amalgamation of the actual servicing of the industry by the 2 key bodies, and I think the property vehicle / trust will start to become something they start to work on the detail
of. Mick, do you think if that does come to fruition that I think, I saw in the report, and you would have too, that NZTR guaranteed stake money, prize money through to, I think it's the end of September, maybe October. Will this deal, do you think that NZTR will be able to maintain current prize money levels, or will they have to slash costs to make the books balance?
To me, I don't think it'll be a slash. I think there'll be a minor cut. I think effectively they wanted 19 million from the TAB New Zealand Reserve Funds. They're getting about half of that. But they won't be making states cuts that will make anybody notice. Like, yes, they might. I think they wanted to give $1 million to Ellerslie to bump up their races because it's the best turnover track. But Ellerslie don't need $1 million. So there's an easy $1 million to cut. I would say, ballparking and understanding their budgets, I would say they'll lose about 5 million in stakes, but of course that's only 2.5 million year on year because they were trying to raise by 2.5 million. So, excuse me, effectively, stakes could go down by 2.5 million. $1 million you were going to give to Ellerslie for God knows what reason. You don't need to do. Some of the bonuses last year, there's a $500,000 bonus up for grabs in the Prasia plate. We don't need it. It's a waste of money. So you could easily cut 2.5 million from the stakes budget, no issues at all. So I don't think there'll be a slashing of anything. I don't think we're going to see $600,000 weight for age races become 300. That's not going to happen, and that's the good news. Probably the longer term question, gentlemen, around stakes is the NZB Kiwi. It's our richest race. It goes up to 4.5 million this year. But that's the final year, or the season, sorry. That's the final year of the current slot holders. And when you have this level of uncertainty, and New Zealand doesn't have a Star City or an Arrowfields and all these places like you have in Australia, and obviously, Godolphin's involved as you do for the Everest, and of course, Yulong. We don't have that. So I think it's going to be really hard to keep the momentum going for the NZB Kiwi, because once you start undermining people's confidence, the days of having $700,000 for a slot might be gone. So I think that might be something. It'll definitely be held in March. It's something I think will need to be restructured for the following year.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Just moving sort of briefly back into the infrastructure world and obviously the project stamina, it felt like a little bit from over here, like it landed as a little bit of, despite the intentions and everything else that was sort of worked out, it landed as a little bit of a knife in the heart of the regional racing and people feeling that, there's a stronger focus towards this. And this is the discussion we're having in Australia as well. How do we sustain? I mean, there's discussions the last couple of weeks about if there was a wagering downturn because of inducements being banned. Aaron Morrison, the Racing Victoria CEO, came out and said the first thing that we need to look at is country racetracks and all this sort of stuff. How much of a danger is it that regional racing model, which has fed a lot of the great stories and I guess that grassroots of New Zealand racing, may be lost in a model where we become very focused on the top end?
It's actually a misinterpretation of the report by a lot of people. So a lot of the community clubs, like my hometown, Greymouth, 9,000 people, Reefton, which has probably 4,000 people, Kamara, they're all still going. What they've done is, the report itself was okay. It was very numbers-based. They were very honest about it, the company who did it, and said, this is numbers-based, this isn't a be-all and end-all. But yes, Oamaru finished on Friday. Rotorua will close. That's where Opie Bosson was born. And you do say to yourself, if you close these tracks, the next generation of Opie Bosson's not come along. So I totally agree with you there. But they haven't closed a lot of the community tracks. They've said you need to keep your standards up, that basically you guys paint your own stands, you do your own sandwiches, you just go have fun. As long as things are safe, you can keep going. And they don't tend to get a lot of great dates. Kamara races on a Saturday, but most of them don't. So a lot of the smaller tracks I was pleasantly surprised to see staying. Some of the tracks they're closing, you're like, okay, do you really need to close Oamaru? It's reserve land. You don't get any money for it. You don't get the chance to sell it to make more money for the industry. But I suppose if you need to close some tracks, and I'm not really sure why you do need to close some tracks, then I don't think they've gone too over the top. But they're not the big issues. The big issue is clearly trying to close Trentham. Yeah. Trying to close Trentham is literally... It'd be like me getting on an Australian radio show and saying, I've done a report and we're closing Eagle Farm. Oh, and Doomben. We just decided we don't need racing in Brisbane anymore. People, what are you talking about? Now, because you're not closing Randwick or Rose Hill, because if you close one of those, as much as it's a dumb idea, you still got racing in Sydney. You still got Warwick Farm. But you're talking about closing racing in Wellington, which is the capital of New Zealand and our second biggest city, and having no racing of any sort. There's no more greyhounds here. The harness racing closed here probably 25 years ago. And you would have no racing in the capital city of New Zealand, which is where the government sits, and no racing for 100 kilometres around it. Well, that's just preposterous. And one of the things that RCP, the company who did Project Stamina, did, which just annoyed people to high heaven, was they said there's travel friction, which is one of those bullshit things people put in consultancy reports, which means there's no horses trained at Trentham, so it's really hard for people to transport horses from Awapuni to Trentham, and it costs the industry money. Well, yes, it does. Two things out of that. First of all, there's no horses trained at Royal Ascot. There's no horses trained at Longchamp. There's no horses trained at Happy Valley. Yes, they're trained at Sha Tin, but it's still a bloody hard way to get across Hong Kong on a Wednesday night. I can tell you that much. There's no horses trained at lots of great tracks around the world. It doesn't stop people racing there. And secondly, for people listening to this who own or train horses, if Bob says to me, and I've got a horse racing this Saturday, it has to go all the way across the North Island, and my trainer, Harvey Wilson, when he says I'm taking the horse to Hastings, I don't say, how much is that going to cost? No one ever says that. It's different if you're going to a different state or a different island, but no one says if you're getting on a float to go 100 kilometres, that's too far to go. And where they really stuffed up is they said travel friction was an issue for Alexandra Park, which is the harness racing track in Auckland. Travel friction was an issue because horses were coming from too far away and it was a cost to the industry and the owners. But Alexandra Park's 1,200 metres from Ellerslie. And Ellerslie was never mentioned with travel friction. So, as you guys know, people will race their horses where they want to. No better example than Moods this week. If I want to take She's and Alibi to Sydney, I'll do it. And that's the same for everybody. If you want to go 200 kilometres into the bush to win a race, travel friction was just bullshit. And once they started it, people looked at it and thought, these are a bunch of consultants from Auckland who don't understand racing. And that really let them down. And for Trentham to be labelled into that basket really hurt them. Then Russell Warwick, who's the outgoing chair of NZTR, came on my show and said, after the report had mentioned the potential for a faulty grandstand, which wasn't earthquake compliant at Trentham, which has been proved wrong, and he said the grandstand is not a factor. So heading forward, be no travel friction's complete bullshit. That's just nonsense. That's a gobbledygook words. And the grandstand isn't an issue at Trentham. And now, over that template, if I'm correct, and I'm pretty sure I am, you're going to have a new governance structure to New Zealand racing in the next 18 months, a totally new boss, a new chief executive, and a new board. And you're going to have a special property vehicle or trust coming on board. Well, then how can you possibly consider closing Trentham when you know the grandstand's okay, you know travel friction's complete bullshit, and you know that there's going to be a whole bunch of people who actually are in power in 18 months who will eventually should be the ones making those decisions. So if what I think is going to happen in the next 2 weeks happens, all the track closures for those who want to stand their ground have to go on hold, because you can't say we're bringing in new bosses, or by the way, we're going to close a whole bunch of stuff before they get here, and especially not Trentham. Trentham's an iconic track in this country. So the idea that it could be closed before a new administration comes on board is totally absurd.
Was Trentham one of the ones that they could sell, or was it just logistical, or they financially said we should close it down?
No, they absolutely, Trentham could be sold, but that again comes back to the fact that NZTR would be, to me, usurping that money. They would get that money. But NZTR is not going to exist in 18 months. It's going to be Central Co, which is the nickname they're giving to the new Central Corporation. If my information's right, I'm pretty sure it is. And then you say under a special property vehicle, Trentham's total value could be usurped into that property vehicle and become part of the national wealth base for racing. So why would you sell it now? Why would you not bunch it together with a whole bunch of stuff to have that superpower? So the idea of selling it to get, because obviously you can't sell it tomorrow. Even if you do sell it, it's going to take a year or two, and the people who are deciding to sell it now and close that track down won't be in power in 2 years, and they won't be getting the money. In fact, the entity they work for won't be in power. So when you're making those big decisions that can't be reversed, you simply don't make them if, as we expect, the governance model is about to change and you are going to launch a special property vehicle, then these things have to go on hold, because once you've done them, they can't be reversed.
I guess from that perspective, it sounds like at the moment that we're sort of, you're going through this change. There's this period of significant change, and a lot of stuff's going on. And understandably, people get nervous. As I said before, change is hard. But in your mind, Mick, are you more optimistic or pessimistic about New Zealand's racing future? Should it go through, I guess, this difficult period, this transition period to go forward? How do you feel like, as a person that's obviously been involved in the industry, and there's a lot of, I guess, different aspects to this, but how do you feel about where things will be heading if the right decisions are made in the next 18 months to 5 years in order to where we see things 5, 10, 15 years down the line? Because there's a danger that things don't get done. We're having another report in 8, 10 years time, and the next report's a lot more drastic.
Brett, it's a funny thing. When Entain came on board 3 years ago, it was like everybody had just discovered alcohol, sex, candy, the whole thing in one day. Oh my God, it's never been so good. And I was saying to people, hey, calm down. This is not what you think it is. This is a sugar rush, and it's bloody good of Entain to come on board. The deal's very fair, but calm down, because all this money being splashed around won't last. And of course it hasn't. But now, when everybody thinks it's doom and gloom, it's not as bad as I think they are. Yeah. The implementation of the special property vehicle, the change to the administration, and getting a good leader, getting a really good chief executive is crucial to this. Those things can solve a lot of these problems in a heartbeat. These aren't billion-dollar problems, and this is a billion-dollar industry. So the equity is there to fix these things, but you need those things put in place, and they're not hard to. New Zealand's strength is so small. We don't have to unite a whole bunch of states like you guys have to. We can just say it's one entity, just get it done. Even some of the stuff isn't even going to need legislative change. We're not going to even need the government to vote on this stuff. We can just do it ourselves, but we need to do it. And I think the first 2 steps down that path will start in the next 2 weeks. So ironically, I was never a rah-rah man when everybody was getting excited 3 years ago, because I knew the fact that this was a sugar rush. I also knew that it would be incredibly hard for Entain to create as much betting momentum as they wanted in racing, but they're creating it in sport, which drip feeds back to racing through TRB New Zealand. So it was never as good as it was supposed to be 3 years ago, when people just turned into zealots. Grown men were raving lunatics. It got to the embarrassing stage where Dean Shannon was literally Jesus. People walked up to him and spoke to him like, "Oh, Dean, can I please have a..." He's just a bloody good bloke. And then people realised that, that wasn't reality, because when you sign a new deal, when a new partnership starts, they very rightly flashed a lot of money around, did a bloody good job for the industry. So this isn't their fault. But people got carried away. And now people are getting carried away with the doom and gloom, but it, again, is very fixable. So the interesting one is one which you boys have to deal with too here is exposing these things.
Yeah.
See, NZTR was living in the shadows a little bit. Not they weren't doing anything wrong. They weren't being corrupt or doing anything naughty. They just didn't want to talk about it much. And everybody kept saying, well, the whole TRB New Zealand thing, we'll all agree we won't talk about it. Well, that's just bullshit. Harness Racing New Zealand, NZTR, and TRB New Zealand, away from commercially sensitive subjects, have a duty to tell people in the industry, because the people out there breeding mares this year, or buying property, or buying horses, and I've got 7 horses going that are ready to runs. I've got $500,000 on the table myself. You have the right to know what's going on in your industry. You are a shareholder of this industry. So anytime clubs or governance bodies start saying, "Oh no," or "we'll keep this," we're working through this, and they send out comms which don't make any sense. Anytime they do that, I think it's disingenuous. And that's why when we had those 2 shows recently in the Guerin report, people were like, "Oh wow, that was really revealing." And it wasn't that the shows were that great. It's just they wanted any information. They were craving for information. But as you boys will be finding out on the other side of this coin is, anytime you tell people the truth, people think that you're shit-canning the industry, you're being negative, you're saying, well, the straight doesn't make up the news. The straight's not making up the Australian government's attitude towards gambling advertising. You're just reporting it. But a lot of people don't want to hear that stuff. And then when you don't talk about it, which has become very prominent on both sides of the Tasman, the industry-backed racing media don't talk about most things. And I understand why. I know these people. These people are my friends. But they're going to get fired. I've been fired by the Herald 3 times. I've been fired by Trackside 3 times. And a lot of that comes down to telling the truth or saying things which are difficult for people to want to comprehend, or your bosses not being happy that you said them. But if you're going to own a website like you boys do, or have the privilege, which I have, of having your own show or working for the New Zealand Herald, I've been racing into the New Zealand Herald for 36 years or 30 years. If you're going to have that privilege, you've got to tell the truth. And if people in the industry want to be well enough informed to make decisions whether to put their horse to a certain stallion this season, they deserve the truth. But they can't also blame you for telling it, because that's just naive. And I think that's one of the confusing spaces we've got into, is so much of the general media now is because it's run by the codes of the clubs, they're terrified to say anything in case it pisses their boss off. But media living in that space is morally wrong in racing, because almost everybody in racing is investing in some way in this game. It's not Collingwood and Carlton.
Yeah.
This isn't something I love because I love the black and white jersey, rah, rah, but it's not going to affect my life. The people in racing, this affects their lives. So therefore, you have to tell them the truth, whether they like it or not.
Tim, anything else from you?
No, I think you summed it up very well, Mick. It is a interesting subject, and even Mark Chittick's on the advisory committee, but reading his father, Gary's opining about this issue in particular. I think even they have differing opinions on the governance or the way racing should be run in New Zealand. That's just how difficult it is to get everyone on the one page and trying to push in the one direction for the betterment of the industry. Everyone is wanting the industry to be better. It's just how you get there and which direction and what is the right answer.
And to me, that's why these 2 decisions, which I believe, once the TRB signs off on the funding, I believe they'll come out in the next 2 weeks. It could even be this week. I don't know. There's so much going on at the moment. Once we decide to go down that path, and they'll need an establishment board to establish the framework for the joint administration and the framework for the special property vehicle. Those things are really important. So I do see that light at the end of the tunnel coming up very quickly. But, and this is the big but, once you have a central administration for New Zealand racing, you need a leader. Because Gary Chiddick deserves his opinion because he's invested millions in the industry, just as much as Mark does, just as much as you guys do, just as much as I do, or my business partner, or anybody else listening to this in New Zealand. They deserve their opinions, but you have to some way laser focus those. We can't just keep throwing stuff at the fan and then getting disappointed when it comes back at us. So we do need a leader. Now, that leader can then put in place really smart financial people and legal people and 2ICs and racing people. But that leader is going to be incredibly crucial to the next 5 years in New Zealand. Now, the obvious person they want is for Landis. He's clearly not going to do it. And the second most logical person they want is Cameron George. And I doubt he'll do it because the Warriors are doing fantastically well and Cameron's incredibly happy there and they've got a great culture. And Cameron could well end up in God knows what positions in Australia.
Yeah.
So then you start saying who would do it? Because we've had a very long legacy in New Zealand of Australian-based leadership. And it's really, really hard to go to another country and stay there and lead for a decade because you miss your family and you have to relearn everything. And then you say to yourself, okay, well, what about Greg Tomlinson or Brendan Lindsay or Sir Peter Vallett? Well, they're not going to do it either. These are extremely wealthy men with fingers in many, many pies and lots of businesses. So what you need to do is find that leader for New Zealand racing who isn't scared to upset people, but wants to tell the truth and do it for the right reasons, but is qualified to do so. And that person also needs to have understanding not only of Parliament, but also of the breeding industry, which is crucial for us, the export market. They need to understand a whole bunch of things. Finding that person is the second biggest challenge New Zealand racing faces. Infrastructure first, that's the big numbers, but New Zealand racing has to find a leader.
And they need to hide as thick as an elephant because the nature of this game, as we've spoken before, is one of opinions.
Well, Breen, you know what? You think that, but I've thought about this a lot recently. You don't. All you need to do is tell the truth.
No.
The truth is a shield. As long as you're telling the truth, you don't need to listen to what other people say, mate, no, I'm telling the truth. You may not like this. Your club may not like it, but I'm telling the truth. It's when you start lying that you need to start covering your tracks. If we get one leader in this country, and I know people are dying from it because those two shows last week where they just sucked out all that information. When you get one leader, then you can start implementing strategies and people will cop you saying things they don't like because they know you're telling the truth.
Then Moncur step up and get the role. Is he in the mix, do you think?
Look, Sam's a really popular guy who's a very good numbers guy. I would not see him in that role. Not a lot of great international leaders tend to be accountants or accountancy-based people. They're the people you bring on board to take care of your finances. Leadership doesn't tend to be. A lot of companies put the chief financial officer in charge, but they don't last particularly long, and it doesn't tend to lead to growth strategies. Sam was someone who will always have a job in New Zealand racing, but I don't think it'll be that job.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think that, I was thinking about this as you were talking before. We talk about the amount of opinions we have in this industry. Like, it is an industry based on opinions. We'll go to a 10-horse race and there'll be 10 people standing there and 10 people think a different horse will win the race. And so therefore, the nature of it means that people have naturally different opinions. And so be able to coordinate those and work within that and be able to absorb that as an industry and work out what the best result is for everyone's part of that challenge.
Also, Bryn, just don't listen to stupid people. Stupid people are pretty easy to find because there's lots of them floating around and you can usually just look at them and say, what's your body of work being?
Yeah.
Now, once you've had John Massara write a report, that's a pretty good starting place. And then you've had this, as I said, this advisory committee, which touched on the guys I've spoken about, but also Ken Brecken was on there, Steve Thompson. These are smart people. If you're going to implement things from smart people. And if some moron comes up to you at the races after 6 beers and starts abusing you, just say, no, I have no interest in that because that you haven't shown me you can make this happen. You haven't shown me you have the skill sets to get involved in this conversation, so stop it. And that's where it comes from. Listen to the smart people. There's plenty of smart people who want to help New Zealand. There's a guy called Greg Tomlinson from the Thoroughbreds. He's really smart, like smart. Now listen to those people. The help's there. But you still need that one boss to say, this is what we're doing, because both codes are going to unite. Forget the greyhound's gone in New Zealand. Both codes are going to unite. But you still need to have, as everybody has, armies, governments, any business, someone's got to be in charge. And if they get a few things wrong, that's okay. But at least they're making decisions. And if they're listening to the right people, those decisions won't be as hard to make as they sound.
It's a tough job for anyone to step up and put their hand up. As you said, a lot of people who would be perfectly qualified to do it won't do it because there's not, it's they'd rather, move past that stage of their life where you want to be in that fight or whatever else. I think the challenge is you probably have to be up. So it sounds like up for the fight. I don't mean in a combative way, but you have to be up for it. You have to be ready for, the reason you spoke about V'landys before, one of the reasons why Peter V'landys has been successful in New South Wales is because he has been given a long tenure to be able to do that. To be able to fight through those opportunities. It takes time to create change and to do those things. And you have to have the right type of personalities involved.
But also, Brad, you've got to be where you want to be.
Yeah.
Like,
you can't be thinking about the thing that's the next thing. You've got to be.
People have asked me heaps of times in my life, why haven't you gone to Hong Kong? Because I love going to Hong Kong. It's one of my favourite places in the world, but I don't want to live there.
Yeah.
And if you're living somewhere you don't want to live, then you're not going to be totally concentrating on this. And it would be a really, really hard job for someone with a young family.
Yeah.
Because again, you would have those, not saying they're distractions, but those wonderful blessings. But it'd be really hard because this is a job which will be all-encompassing. It is 18 hours a day. It will be New Zealand Racing's version of being racing's prime minister or the president. You will have to think about this all day. And to do that, you have to love it and you have to care about it. And then you are happy to put your ego aside and go say, well, excuse me, Mr. Tomlinson or Mr. Lindsay or Mr. Waller, what would you do in this situation? And it's easy to do that when you genuinely care about it. But if you're doing it for the money and trying to keep your job, you're not going to do that. And that's the person they're going to need to find. And that person's going to need to say, well, this is the next 5 years of my life and this is all I care about. Much like being an NRL coach or one of those things. You have to say, you can't do those jobs if you don't love them. And that's going to be really, really interesting. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. I think there's some really positive news on the way. Things aren't as bad as people think they are. We are going to solve this, but we first of all need to put all that other shit aside and say, right, let's get this done and let's go find someone we can believe in and give them the freedom to do something. And that person needs to go talk to the smart people and stop listening to the dumb ones.
There we go. For those who are still with us after that extended chat, great to have a chat with Mick. It really there's I think, Tim, what we got out of it was this notion of the fact that there's a lot going on in New Zealand, but there's also a lot of different, I guess, misinformation that's sort of out there, and there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of change going on. It'd be really interesting to see where things land in the next sort of 4 to 6 weeks, won't it?
We did promise Mick we'd keep him for 20 minutes. We went for sort of closer to 40. So thanks, Mick. But yeah, sounds like there's going to be something more concrete happening in the next couple of weeks. And as Mick said, it's going to take strong leadership to row the boat forward, I guess, in whether it's the right or wrong direction, that in a direction rather than treading water as it appears to be at the moment.
Looking for your next opportunity in racing, breeding or wagering, or searching for the right person to join your team? The Straight Jobs is the industry's dedicated careers platform, connecting employers with talented professionals right across the thoroughbred sector. For the latest opportunities in industry careers, go to jobs.thestraight.com.au. Tim, before we head off, anything else, any other matters?
Just looking forward to getting to the Hunter Valley. Brent, enjoy this time of year, sort of on the eve of spring, and everyone's always optimistic at this time of year, and the studs do a great job hospitality-wise and throwing open the gates and put on a good show. So looking forward to their company and yours, I must say too, Brent.
Terrific, Tim. Can't wait for it. We'll see you tomorrow. We're on our way up. Thanks for joining us on Straight Talk, brought to you by Darley and Inglis. Don't forget to give us a rating wherever you listen to your podcast. Be sure to subscribe and never miss an episode. Be sure to become a member of The Straight. Access all our articles online there and have a look at what you can get. And we encourage you to do that as well. Send us an email at editor@thestraight.com.au if you think there's anything you'd like us to discuss on Straight Talk. Thanks for your time. We'll talk to you again next week.